Hello everybody and welcome back to TenTillDeath's Vintage Crypt. And yes, you have read that title right. What we are about to show on camera is not just any magazine, but it was a magazine that even as far as the state of Georgia tried to get this magazine banned. That's how controversial this magazine was. But today we are going to be talking about the High Times magazine. And this magazine series, this publication originally released in the 70s. And the person who originally created the High Times magazine series, they tried another magazine publication that involved, weed, THC, all of that stuff beforehand. Unfortunately, it failed, but they found their, most success with the High Times magazine. Also, viewer discretion on this. Yeah, my little cousin's over there in the background. Well, my little nephew. So if you guys hear any sounds, that's coming from my little nephew. But it is what it is. So, what is this magazine exactly? The High Times, as I said earlier, it was a pro-marijuana, recreational drug magazine that came out around the 1970s. And owning one of these magazines from people that I knew that actually owned one, or from people that were there during that time period, they said owning one of these magazines, well, it was one of those things you would just hide. You would just hide from people. You did not want to be caught with it, because having a copy of one of these magazines, it was really dangerous, because you got to remember, back in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, recreational drugs, marijuana, weed, what we got now, Delta, all of that stuff, pretty much illegal. So having a magazine that promotes those products, that was very risky. And like I said, it got so out of hand with the publications that were against this single magazine, with political activists that were against this magazine, that the state of Georgia really tried their hardest to get this magazine banned, and it did not work. So, let's take a look inside of this magazine. So, we'll look at several pages, and hopefully YouTube does not ban me, and I'll explain how I got this magazine. There is a coworker that I had at work that I worked with at a previous job, right? And me and this coworker, we were talking, and he was telling me, he's like, you got to check out this magazine called The High Times. And he's an old fellow. And he was telling me, he's like, it's a magazine I used to read when I was younger. And he was telling me about what was in that magazine. But he said that I would like it because there's a comic in this magazine called Zippy the Pinhead. And so about a month or two went by after we had that conversation, and we didn't really, I didn't really think about it too much, about that conversation, until about 2 months later, after we had that conversation. I was like, let me go on eBay and try to find a copy of one of the High Time magazines. So I found this copy, and it had the Zippy the Pinhead comics in it and stuff like that. And I got this copy off of eBay, which, thanks to that seller, being willing to, sell it to me. And this is, unironically, this is the Zippy the Pinhead comic right here on this page. And I took it to work, and I showed that guy, because like I said, he's like, yeah, I used to read that magazine when I was younger. And I let him hold it, and he was just baffled. He's like, oh my God, this kid actually pulled through and, found this magazine I used to read when I was younger. Holy crap. And as you can tell, you can see that there's all sorts of different, recreational use products in here. But owning one of these magazines back in the day probably would have, got you in trouble, a lot of trouble. And this magazine also covers politics and stuff like that. And has all sorts of different, funny stories and stuff. So, for those that owned a copy of the High Times or used to read the High Times, because unfortunately the High Times is not in publication anymore, how was it? Did you like reading the High Times? Did you like the Zippy the Pinhead comics that were found in the High Times? Did you know someone that owned a copy of one of the High Times magazines from back in the day? Did you get in trouble for owning a copy of the High Times back in the day? You know, or is it sitting on your shelf? Like, what's going on? Let me know your stories. Let me know your thoughts about this magazine. Comment below. Until next time, this has been TenTillDeath's Vintage Crypt. Peace.